Is the Bible a reliable book? I think that's a question we really ought to talk about. Recently, on Facebook, a meme was being passed around that made some rather ignorant claims about the history and the transmission of the text of the Bible. I didn't think too much of that, but was quite surprised when earlier this week in a public debate, the science guy, Bill Nye, started repeating that same misinformation about the Bible. You've probably heard this before. How can we trust a book that's been passed along generation to generation, copies upon copies upon copies, translations upon translations, down through the generations? Isn't it obvious that the message is going to be corrupted by that sort of a procedure? We've all played, when we're children, the fun icebreaker game, the telephone game. You know how that works. You get a group of children around, or even adults can do this. You gather around and one person starts in a line and says a phrase or a sentence, and then the next person whispers it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, and it's very humorous and funny to see what the message ends up being on the other end of the chain. The telephone game, it's hilarious. It starts out with perfectly innocuous statement and at the end ends up in pure gibberish. Isn't it obvious that that is what we have when we're talking about an ancient text like the Bible? A message being transmitted over generations. Isn't it bound to be like the telephone game? How can we really trust that what is in this book is what was actually originally written? I think that's a question we need to talk about, because there seems to be widespread public and cultural ignorance on that question, especially when somebody reputed to be a scientist or a scholar can make such poor mistakes. Is it like the telephone game? Well, not at all. A telephone game is designed specifically to corrupt the message. That's the whole point of the telephone game. There are rules in place that ensure that this message will be corrupted. You can only whisper it, number one. You can only whisper it one time, okay? And you whisper it one time in the ear, and then the person has to whisper it one time. There are rules that are guaranteeing corruption as you pass along the message. Well, is that the character? Is that the nature of how the Bible was transmitted? Not at all. It was really nothing like the telephone game. Nobody was copying a text of Scripture just one time. No one person was copying a text. Nobody ever had complete control over the text. There were multiple copies. One of the fundamentally interesting things about early Christianity and its use of religious texts is that these texts were public texts. You see, in early centuries, mystery religions and Gnostic groups were very elitist in their view of religious enlightenment. They loved secrets. Gnosticism simply means secret knowledge. And so the truths of the religious views were secret. They were for the elite. They were for the initiated. Very much unlike that, New Testament writers were writing public documents. They were writing letters to complete churches, not just pastors, but lay people as well. These texts were read aloud in public. They were copied. They were sent to other churches for them to read aloud and to copy and to disseminate it widely. One of the amazing things about the Bible, or the text of the New Testament, is how rapidly in the early centuries it spread all over the known Mediterranean world. These were public texts, not private, elite texts for small, special groups. This public nature of the documents mitigates against it being a telephone game sort of situation. But I want to step back as we launch into a series of commentaries on this question about the reliability of the New Testament, and just get the bigger picture. What we're dealing with are ancient documents. We have, in various forms, a variety of forms, something like 5,700 existing manuscripts of the New Testament, copies of the New Testament in various forms, fragments or full copies. 5,700. Do you know how many copies of Plato's works we have, the philosopher? We have 7. You see, people that know anything about ancient documents know this unfortunately little-known truth. The text of the New Testament is the most reliable ancient document known to the human race. It's the most reliable. Scholars of antiquity who deal with Aristotle and Plato and Herodotus and Thucydides look on in envy with the amount of material, witness New Testament scholars have to the reliability of their text. In fact, among all of those copies, 5,700 copies of the New Testament, the actual text of the New Testament is something like 97% certain. That means that some copies disagree with each other here and there, but on the whole, 97% is completely certain and reliable. We're going to talk in coming weeks, well, what about those differences in the copies? Doesn't that cast doubt as to the reliability of the text? The answer is no, and we're going to talk about that.